General remarks on in the general direction of a critical romantic socio-phenomenological humanist program of art, life and politics. In rejoinder to at least one drunken allegation of fascism, my sub-thesis is that the ideal state of self-actualization, which I without apology speak of in an essentialist way, which I believe the ego machine can pretty well back up these days, was quite elegantly explicated in profound nuance by Schiller, whose masterful anticipation of the be-sensitive whole person and find your feminine side and eat your granola pop psychology of today was subsequently violently chopped into by continental philosophers, who established ichtetus religions of the Ding and Sich, irresponsibly ignoring the still quite unrefuted constraints of Kantian phenomenalism. The result was, on the one hand, the total externalization of the formal instinct, as seen in the descendants of Hegel, and the construction of sociological orientation of the critical school, which projects highly symmetrical patterns onto a chaotic history, mistaking them for science, while slighting the internal structures of subjective experience, aside from a flirtation with Freud, for whom the unconscious is just an unstructured waste dump. On the other hand, the descendants of Schopenhauer elevated a crude and purely destructive conception of the sensual instinct, leading either to nihilistic individualism in the various Nietzscheisms, or the expression of the romantic elevation of passion within the narrow strictures of folkish xenophobia and the poisonous fetishism of geography and race. It is my belief that Romanticism is to Nazism, as democracy was to governing structure of Athens, the elevation of the noblest ideas among a tiny minority who were making it their business to plunder and destroy everything outside of the narrow confines of what they considered humanity. In the humanities, it results in a false dichotomy between an obscurant behaviorism, which poses as the legitimate representative of all oppressed peoples, and a fascistic, platonic essentialism which may or may not exist at all. My intention is to re-establish the centrality of art as a primary human activity, for which there is certainly a well-established empirical case. It is good for you and will make you happy. As I stated in Chapter 0, this basic need is trounced upon by all of the major political systems that have arisen in modernity. As delineated by Benjamin, fascism proceeds by making the state a canvas, socialism by demanding that all art should be about socialism, or else, and capitalism by replacing it with Andy Warhol and McDonald's. Having established this, I make the claim that the celebratory enjoyment, the aesthetic as something of essential value, is not in the least incompatible with a critical political approach to its social functions and the ways in which the symbolic and the beautiful are employed, consciously or unconsciously, to serve the ends of ideology. It is in fact only by the embrace of a holistic essentialism that an explanatory framework can finally emerge for effectiveness of within perpetuating false consciousness. The approaches are thus complementary. The polarities of folkish subjectivism and totalistic Marxian formalism are analogous to the uncultivated states of sense and form as defined by Schiller. The former he referred to as savagery, the latter as barbarism. Later, Camus would refer to these polarities, culminating in Stalinism and Nazism, as rational and irrational violence, respectively, both of which he found, as do I, equally repugnant. What I seek out, in the political, psychological, phenomenological, and aesthetic fields, are exemplary figures whose works represent a refusal, in the genuine, inclusive humanistic sense, of the false dichotomy between individualism and collectivity, between the creative and practical needs of human beings, between the subjective phenomenological and the objective sociological poles of living experience, and, above all, who acknowledge the basic human need for creative and meaningful life activity over and above crude basics of food, medicine, clothing, shelter, and physical protection. In philosophical aesthetics, I have already mentioned Schiller. In poetry, Shelley stands out particularly, with his refusal of the distinction between the programs of Romanticism and the Enlightenment. For him, the revolutionary striving for political liberty was synonymous with the liberation of the human emotional life. He had a wife who is pretty groovy too. Politically, I would sweep away the pointy-headed abstractions of a century of critical theory, and replace it with Piotr Kropotkin and his descendants up to Chomsky. His critique of all modern political systems and modes of production is every bit as relentless, but maintains an unwavering respect for the individual as the basic unit making up the social, and a deeply humanistic insistence on the existence of a nature which is constructive, positive and purposive, forming the biological basis for such basic and ubiquitous phenomena as mutual aid, nurturing and empathy, and the ever-recurrent revolt of human communities against the structures of political power, which simply would not happen if we were only empty vessels of culturally conditioned ideology. Phenomenologically, I would replace in the humanities the various descendants of Freud with Jung, who does indeed have his own problems, but is deserving of at least the same charitable process of revision that has dumbfoundingly turned Freud, of all people, into a feminist and a rainbow flag-waving LGBTQ parade zealot. You can turn Jung into those things with a lot less work, and the structure of his interpretive approach, while indeed not science, would place literary and art criticism in an ontological framework which is broadly metaphorically compatible with things that are now understood in the behavioral, neurological and evolutionary sciences. Given his work's deep roots in the ethology and anthropology of the time, indeed his software is outdated, but I'm speaking of paradigmatic frames, and not the canonical elevation of the primary texts here. As an artistic exemplar, I nominate Chagall, whose depictions of Eros embody indeterminate concept, the free play of the faculties, and the unified simultaneity of absolute unity and binary differentiation, in which the duality of his subjects merge androgynously into one another, and together merge into the surrounding world, in which time, space and object are united in a seamless organic unity, but in which the particularity of each subject always remains. Throughout his work, an all-encompassing cosmopolitanism is inseparable from his Gemeinschaftsschaffung for his native village of Vitebsk. Musicologically, I believe this approach to life is exemplified by Moses Ash, founder of Ash Records, later Smithsonian Folkways, whose radical universalism consisted not in the then quite popular quest for global conformity and homogeneity, but rather in the pluralistic celebration of the radical locality of the creative traditions of all human cultures. This insistence upon the symbiosis of radical localism with absolute universalism in the context of a radically anti-authoritarian ethics constitutes the only approach to politics, aesthetics, ethics and phenomenology which offers a solution to the tripartite program of human extinction which emanates from the radically anti-humanistic authoritarian camps of atomistic commodity culture, totalistic status collectivism, and vocish humanism, just for us humans, identity politics. While one might wish to play a superficial game of 6 degrees to Adolf Hitler, that analogy is deeply superficial. I believe that an ideology of liberation is a paradoxical proposition, so it is only as a last point that I formulated the set of political ideological slogans which constitute the apotheosis of the aesthetic above, to make clear that insofar as organized political activity of any kind is necessary in the world, I, and you should too, categorically renounce, with the utmost vehemence, any and all agendas which 1. subjugate the creative potentials of the human being to their perverse quest for political power, and 2. Do not regard the authentic realization of this creative potential of every human being as an immediate necessity, not an abstract, symbolic, or rhetorical slogan. Again, I refer the reader to Kropotkin, who devotes the better part of the conquest of bread to what he terms the need for luxury. He makes very clear that all of the physical provisions of society are but precursors for this. Whereas his socialist rivals spoke of these things as distant goals, putting them off to the end of history, Kropotkin made art, music and good food, not just food, the immediate goal of his revolutionary fantasy novel. In his plan, these would have been the primary activities of the community in a matter of weeks, not decades or centuries, or as is really the case in all of our existing political systems, never. No, I do not believe that such a transformation is literally possible, but it is the only acceptable normative template I can think of upon which to gauge our actions and activities within the constraints of the possible world. If we are to have ideals, they should be good ones, and big ones. If you want something practical out of me, that sees it in the real world, I would, referring the reader to the forthcoming empirical section on the beneficial effects of drawing, painting, singing and whatevering, demand an immediate end to the fiscal war against funding for arts and humanities education. I would insist, in fact, that it be made a matter of public health policy, on an equal footing with physical education, nutrition, medicine and shelter. It is important not to raise a civilization of dullards and morons, and it just might help to teach people from a very early age that they are capable of something, even in the absence of resources. I would insist upon making anthropology and ethnomusicology part of the core curriculum of early childhood education, stamping into the pigsty, once and for all, our contemporary belief that these subjects are just junk college majors for kids that didn't do good in math.